This podcast is not safe for work and will feature movie spoilers. It will feature scenes described of a graphic nature. It will contain language which most listeners may find offensive. Welcome to the podcast Under the Stairs. Hi everyone and welcome to the podcast Under the Stairs. I'm your host Duncan McLeish. Welcome to the show. So yeah, I've been away for about a month and a half. Like I said, I would be kind of basically up to my eyes in French new wave erotic slash sci-fi slash horror slash construct of life itself, thought-provoking cinema for this series, which we're going to be running through the entire of the summer. Now, some people would call it a summer series, but the term summer series means something near and dear to the hearts of regular and long-time sufferers of the podcast Under the Stairs. So let's just say it this way. This is how we're spending our summer together, rather than calling it a summer series. I have been diligently working my way through the Indicator series of Jean Rollin movies. And we're going to spend our entire summer doing I've forgotten the number of them. I think we're going to be doing about 8 episodes, I think, of Jean Rollin movies. We're going to be doing 2 at a time. And that will take us up to date with the current release cycle of Jean Rollin films that Indicator had put out on 4K and 4K UHD. They may have put it out on Blu-ray as well, to be fair, but you know me, only the best shall do for Duncan. Only a 4K UHD will be played on my TV. So yeah, this is the inaugural episode of what will be a relatively fun exploration of Jean Rollin. Now, you may be a listener out there that knows nothing about Jean Rollin. You may be one of these people that is like, I went through my entire life blissfully unaware of what French New Wave cinema is and the exploits of one Mr. Rollin. Now, if that is the case, that is fine. This is the perfect time to pick up on it because we are literally running the train right through those Indicator releases, which are all available now, and may I say moderately priced for what you actually get in them. And Indicator are not sponsoring, hopefully reposting the episodes, but not sponsoring the episodes. So yeah, this is the perfect time to get in on the ground floor because we are doing them in order. So we'll be going through chronological order, starting on this episode with the first 2 releases. That being and YouTube's going to love this, The Rape of the Vampire from 1968, and his follow-up, Semaphore title, which is The Nude Vampire from 1970. So yeah, these are the 2 lovely box sets here, packed with special features. Prints never been better. Now, these are not going to necessarily review the actual Blu-ray releases. I will give scores on the overall product at the very end, but rather discussions of Rollin the filmmaker, bit of history behind the productions, going to highlight some of the stuff that I like specifically of them, and kind of what you should be looking out for. Now, this won't be everyone's jam. I'm fully aware of that. In the past summer series, which this is not, but summer series have been aimed at kind of casting a wide net over relatively popular and sometimes obscure titles as a way to kind of open your eyes to adjacent titles that you may have missed on the first run. We're not doing that this time. This time we are going nitty gritty in the weeds with it. You guys know I love art house. This is about as art house as kind of erotic Euro cinema gets. So this is really a series just for me, if I'm being honest. And hopefully some of you guys out there as well. I have put the legwork in on this one, so hopefully you will enjoy. If you're checking this out on YouTube, or you've got the video version of this podcast, essentially both reviews are kind of video essays to an extent, where I can play short clips with no volume of parts of the movie and stills from the movie as well to give a kind of a bit of a visual presence to some of what you're actually seeing me discuss. If you're only doing the audio version, the wording of this has been written in such a way that you should be able to take away from this my intent minus the visuals. So pick your poison. Maybe do both. That bumps up my numbers. But failing that, I hope you enjoy what we're going to do here. And hopefully you get a chance to check out the movies. And maybe, just maybe, you are a future Jean Rollin fan in the making, which would be awesome. And if you are not, then maybe this reaffirms all the reasons you don't like his cinema. Either way, thank you very much for checking out this episode. Let's get to it, shall we? So up first on this episode, like I say, we're doing the first two titles that the man made, released via Indicator, the label. We're going to be doing The Rape of the Vampire from 1968. We're then going to follow up with The Nude Vampire from 1970. So sit back in your comfy chair, make sure the good headphones are on, and let me take you away on a journey to when cinema was maybe a simpler place, but at the same time equally confusing. I'm going to be back to discuss The Rape of the Vampire from 1968 right after this. Jean Rollin accidentally invents dream horror vampires, and cinema was never quite the same again. Intro. There are vampire movies, and then there are Jean Rollin vampire movies. Most vampire films give you rules. Jean Rollin gives you atmosphere, existential sadness, and women wandering through graveyards looking like they've just escaped from a gothic fashion shoot at 4 a.m. You don't really watch a Jean Rollin movie. You drift through it. And with The Rape of the Vampire in 1968, Rollin didn't just make his debut feature. He basically created an entire emotional and visual blueprint for the next 2 decades of his career. The abandoned castles, the melancholic vampires, the erotic dream logic, the obsession with death, beauty and loneliness. It all starts here. And the truly fascinating thing is, this film almost feels like it shouldn't exist at all. It's messy, fragmented, occasionally baffling. It sometimes feels less like a movie and more like somebody's filming a recurring dream after surviving on red wine and surrealist poetry for a week. And yet, somehow, nearly 60 years later, people are still discovering Jean Rollin through this film. Because no one else made horror movies quite like this. Not Hammer, not Universal, not even Mario Bava, and certainly no other European exploitation filmmakers. Rollin occupied this bizarre middle ground between arthouse cinema and exploitation horror, too strange for the mainstream audiences and too pulpy for the critics. And over time, the outsider quality became exactly what made him special. And The Rape of the Vampire is ground zero for all of it. Before Rollin, the vampire was already an icon. By the late 1960s, the vampire movie was already one of horror cinema's most reliable genres. Universal had turned Dracula into a cinematic horror icon decades earlier through Bela Lugosi. Then Hammer Horror came along and reinvented the vampire for colour cinema, with Christopher Lee's towering bloodshot aristocrat dominating scenes through the late 50s and 60s. Hammer films were lush, elegant and structured. They had stories you could actually follow. Jean Rollin looked at that entire gothic tradition and basically said, interesting, but what if the vampires were more like ghosts trapped inside a poem? And suddenly, the vampire stopped being the villain. In Rollin's world, vampires become symbols of alienation, longing and emotional decay. His undead aren't conquerors, they're drifters, outsiders, lonely immortals wandering through collapsing landscapes while looking permanently heartbroken. And importantly, Rollin wasn't just influenced by horror cinema. You can feel the French New Wave all over this movie. The loose pacing, the experimental structure, the sense that mood matters more than narrative. There are moments in The Rape of the Vampire where it honestly feels like Jean-Luc Godard accidentally made an erotic vampire nightmare. Which means audiences in 1968 had absolutely no idea what to do with this thing. The production, or how to accidentally make a cult film. The behind-the-scenes story of The Rape of the Vampire is almost perfectly suited to the film itself because the production was complete chaos. Originally, Rollin had been hired to make a short featurette, essentially the first half of this film titled The Vampire Woman. The section follows a young psychoanalyst investigating four mysterious sisters who live isolated in a crumbling chateau and genuinely believe themselves to be vampires. And honestly, the first half feels relatively coherent by Rollin standards. It's strange, dreamy and theatrical, but there's a clear atmosphere and mystery running through it. Then, the producers reportedly saw potential for commercial distribution and suddenly demanded a full-length feature, which meant Rollin had to rapidly invent an entirely new second half. And this is where the film fully transforms into beautiful madness. The second section introduced vampire cults, ritual ceremonies, surreal dream imagery, psychic breakdowns, and a vampire queen who feels less like a character and more like a supernatural concept floating throughout the movie. The narrative basically dissolves into mood, but weirdly, that chaotic construction becomes part of the film's identity, because The Rape of the Vampire doesn't feel manufactured. It feels discovered. Like Rollin himself is figuring out what his cinema is while the cameras are actually rolling. And there's something kind of magical about that. The beginning of Rollin time. One of the first things new viewers notice about Jean Rollin films is that they operate on entirely their own rhythm. Characters pause strangely, scenes drift unexpectedly, people walk very slowly through graveyards while looking emotionally devastated for reasons the audience may never fully understand. And once you adjust to that wavelength, the films themselves become hypnotic. Rollin is obsessed with dream logic. Not nightmare logic, dream logic. There is a difference. Nightmares are chaotic and aggressive. Rollin's films are melancholic and trance-like. They move like memories. Half the time it feels like the scenes are connected emotionally rather than narratively. And The Rape of the Vampire establishes this immediately. The long silences, the repetitive imagery, the surreal conversations, it's almost ritualistic. And you can already see the DNA of later Rollin masterpieces like Fascination, Lips of Blood, and The Living Dead Girl forming right here. And trust me, as we run through this series, we will cover in detail that connective, weaving Rollin wavelength. This is the prototype, the rough sketch that somehow already contains the entire painting. The visual style. Beauty through decay. What makes Rollin unforgettable isn't technical perfection, it's visual obsession. This man loved ruined locations with the intensity of a gothic poet. Cemeteries, beaches, abandoned castles, fog-covered fields, old stone architecture slowly being reclaimed by nature. And The Rape of the Vampire constantly frames its characters against spaces that feel forgotten by time itself. The chateau in particular becomes this perfect Rollin environment, beautiful but decaying, romantic but haunted. And then there are the women. Flowing white dresses, pale skin, wide-eyed staring into the middle distance like they're foreseen the end of civilization, but they're being very elegant about it. Rollin's imagery is so distinctive that once you've seen one of his films, you instantly recognise his visual language forever. Even people who dislike his movies often admit, yeah, but it looked incredible, right? And considering the microscopic budgets he was working with, that's genuinely impressive. Rollin understood something crucial. If the atmosphere is strong enough, audiences will forgive almost anything, including plots that occasionally feel held together by moonlight and vibes. The cast. performing like they're under a spell. One thing worth mentioning is that performances in Rollin films exist on a very particular frequency. Naturalism is not the goal here. Characters often speak like they're in the middle of an avant-garde stage play or a especially emotional seance. The lead performances carry this strange detached quality that actually enhances the surrealism. Nobody behaves entirely like a real person, yet everyone feels suspended somewhere between fantasy and reality. And honestly, that artificiality becomes part of the dream atmosphere. The standout figures are the four vampire sisters themselves, who immediately establish one of Rollin's defining fascinations: women as mystical, tragic figures existing outside conventional society. Rollin's male characters often seem confused, powerless, or emotionally adrift. The women feel eternal. That recurring dynamic would define his entire career. So let's talk about that title. So yeah, we need to address the title, because The Rape of the Vampire is the kind of title that absolutely will stop modern audiences right in their tracks. Importantly though, the film itself does not depict the kind of literal narrative content that many people understandably assume from that title. Instead, it's operating symbolically, the violation or destruction of the vampire myth itself. But this was also 1968 and exploitation cinema, where distributors knew provocative titles sold tickets, and Rollin's career would constantly wrestle with that contradiction. Because beneath the lurid marketing and erotic imagery was a filmmaker making deeply personal, melancholic art films about loneliness and death. He just happened to package them inside vampire movies, featuring occasional nudity and surreal blood rituals, which means critics often had absolutely no idea how seriously to take him. The soundtrack and the power of silence. Another reason the film works as well as it does is because of its sound design and music. Rollin understood that atmosphere isn't just visual. The soundtrack drifts between eerie and hypnotic, while silence itself becomes incredibly important. Wind, footsteps, and environmental sounds create this uncanny emptiness throughout the movie. There are scenes where almost nothing happens narratively, but the atmosphere becomes overwhelming. And this would become another major Rollin trademark. His films breathe, they linger. Modern horror editing often moves at hyperspeed because filmmakers are terrified audiences might get bored. Rollin was completely unafraid of stillness. Sometimes he practically weaponizes it. And while that pacing absolutely won't work for everyone, it creates an immersive dream state almost unlike anything else in horror cinema. Audience reaction. This isn't Dracula. When The Rape of the Vampire first released, reactions were, well, mixed. And by mixed, I mean audiences reportedly became openly hostile, which honestly does make sense. Imagine walking into a cinema expecting a traditional vampire movie and instead getting surrealist dream horror where nobody explains anything and half the characters look like they've escaped from an experimental theatre production. Critics largely dismissed the film as pretentious nonsense or incoherent exploitation. But then something interesting happened. Over the years, Rollin slowly built a cult audience, particularly during the VHS era. Horror fans started discovering these strange European films during late night rentals and bootleg trades. And suddenly, the very thing critics hated became the reason people loved him. The dream logic, the atmosphere, the melancholy, the absolute refusal to conform. Modern horror audiences have become much kinder to filmmakers like Rollin because audiences now appreciate personal genre cinema in ways critics often didn't back then. Especially horror fans, because horror fans are often willing to embrace films that feel genuinely unique, even when they're flawed. Oh yes, and Rape of the Vampire is gloriously flawed. The legacy and the birth of the Rollin universe. Looking back now, this film feels less like a debut and more like a declaration. Almost every major Jean Rollin theme begins here. Vampirism as sadness, death as romance, women as spectral wanderers, ruins as emotional spaces, dreams overpowering reality, and the collision between eroticism and mortality. And while later films would refine these ideas much more successfully, there's something fascinating about them seeing emerging in raw form here. You're literally watching a filmmaker invent himself. And perhaps that's why The Rape of the Vampire remains so compelling despite its imperfections. It feels authentic. This wasn't committee-made horror. This wasn't trend chasing. This was one deeply eccentric filmmaker putting his obsessions directly on the screen and hoping audiences would follow him into the fog. Some didn't, and many still won't, but the ones who do tend to become lifelong Rollin fans. Because once his cinema clicks with you, it really clicks. Final thoughts on The Rape of the Vampire. The Rape of the Vampire isn't always easy to watch in the conventional sense. Sometimes it's confusing, sometimes it drifts, sometimes it feels like the movie itself has fallen into a trance, but it's also hypnotic, beautiful, eerie and historically fascinating. This is where Jean Rollin's dream world begins. A world filled with lonely immortals, abandoned castles, surreal rituals, and vampires who always seem moments away from either crying or staring meaningfully at the ocean for 20 uninterrupted minutes. And honestly, horror cinema is much richer for it. Because while there are technically better vampire films out there, there are very few that feel this personal, or this strange, or this unmistakably alive. The Nude Vampire from 1970. Jean Rollin learns to tell a story without losing the dream. Intro. Last time, we stepped into Jean Rollin's strange little corner of horror cinema for what I imagine might have been, for a few of you listeners out there, the very first time. And let's be honest, it's a weird place. The Rape of the Vampire wasn't interested in explaining itself, and it drifted from scene to scene like a dream, occasionally stopping just long enough to remind you that there was technically vampires involved before wandering back into another ruined castle. It wasn't polished, it wasn't conventional, but it was unmistakably Jean Rollin. And now, 2 years later, Rollin returned with his second feature, and something very interesting had happened. The Nude Vampire still feels like no one else could have made it. It's still dreamlike, it's still surreal. It's still populated by mysterious women, secret societies, and people who spend an awful lot of time silently staring at each other in beautiful locations. But underneath all of that, there's a filmmaker beginning to understand narrative. This is still unmistakably a Rollin film. It's just a Rollin film that's learned a few new tricks. And for me, that's what makes The Nude Vampire such an important stop on this journey. It's the moment where you stop asking, who is Jean Rollin? And start asking, what kind of filmmaker is he becoming? The Sophomore Challenge. Making your first film is hard. Making your second film might actually be harder. With your debut, you can spend years refining ideas, chasing funding and obsessing over every frame. And the second film? Well, now people expect you to prove the first one wasn't a fluke. Rollin also found himself working in a France that was changing rapidly. The aftermath of the events of May 1968 had left French cinema in a fascinating place. The new wave directors had blown apart traditional filmmaking, audiences were becoming more adventurous, censorship was loosening, and European genre cinema was becoming increasingly willing to mix horror, science fiction, eroticism, and political allegory together. Suddenly, Rollin found himself making films at exactly the right moment. Not because audiences fully understood him, to be honest I don't think anyone ever will, it's just because cinema itself was becoming weirder. The story. Yes, there's actually more of one this time. One of the biggest surprises revisiting the Nude Vampire is simply this: it's easier to follow. Not Hollywood easy, let's not get carried away, but compared to The Rape of the Vampire, there's an actual sense of momentum here. Our protagonist, Pierre, becomes fascinated by a mysterious woman being held captive inside his father's secluded estate. What follows gradually unfolds into conspiracies, secret organisations, pseudoscientific experimentation, and, naturally, you guessed it, vampires. Although with Rollin, vampires never really mean what you think it means. They're less supernatural monsters and more symbolic beings. Victims. Outcasts. Almost alien in their separation from humanity. The plot slowly peels back layers instead of throwing dream imagery at you and hoping for the best, and honestly, that does make a huge difference. For the first time, Rollin trusts audiences to become emotionally invested before disappearing into his surrealist instincts. It's still dream logic, just dream logic with a better sat-nav. Everything looks more expensive. One thing that immediately jumps out when watching The Nude Vampire is just how much more confident Rollin's filmmaking has become. There's simply more production value on the screen. The locations feel richer, the interiors are grander, the costumes even have a stronger identity, even the lighting feels considerably more deliberate. Rollin always had an eye for composition, but here you begin to see genuine confidence behind the camera. Frames are cleaner, movement is smoother, scenes breathe naturally rather than feeling assembled out of necessity. It's still unmistakably low-budget cinema, so let's not think he's sold out. It's just low-budget cinema made by someone who knows exactly what images fascinate him. One of Rollin's greatest gifts has always been making limited resources look dreamy and luxurious. Give him one abandoned chateau, 6 candles, and an actress in a flowing white fabric dress, and somehow he'll create an image that lives in your head for years. Jean-Jacques Renaud, The Secret Weapon. If the Nude Vampire looks noticeably more accomplished, a huge amount of that credit belongs behind the camera. Jean-Jacques Renaud returns as cinematographer, but this time the partnership with Rollin feels much more assured. The photography has a softness to it. Light pours through windows, fog wraps itself around architecture, faces almost seem sculpted rather than photographed. Rollin would become famous for his use of beaches and cemeteries later on, but you start to see here another obsession emerge. Interiors. Grand hallways, secret laboratories, heavy curtains, old staircases. Everything feels like some way you'd happily explore, provided there wasn't an immortal cult operating in the basement. The visual storytelling has matured enormously. Even when nothing much is happening, the images remain captivating. Science fiction? Wait, what? Here's something that often surprises newcomers. The Nude Vampire isn't really just a vampire movie. It's science fiction. Well, at least Jean Rollin's version of science fiction. Secret organisations, experiments, mass ceremonies, pseudoscience, mysticism and alien imagery. It all blends together into something that feels unlike almost any horror film being made in Europe around 1970. Rollin doesn't care about explaining how any of this works. He cares about the feeling it creates, which is probably why the film feels so modern today. Genre boundaries mean absolutely nothing here, and horror slides comfortably into fantasy, when fantasy then slides into science fiction, and of course, inevitably, science fiction will slide into surrealism, and somehow it all still feels like one coherent dream. The women still hold the power. If the first film established Rollin's fascination with mysterious women, The Nude Vampire doubles down on it. The titular vampire is almost silent throughout much of the film. She becomes an object of fascination for everyone around her, not because she's seductive in the traditional vampire sense, but because she represents something unknowable. Rollin's women often seem disconnected from ordinary humanity. They're tragic rather than monstrous, ancient rather than evil, they belong somewhere else. It's one of the reasons his films continue to divide audiences. Some critics will view these characters as symbols stripped of agency. Others see them as powerful, mystical figures who dominate every scene they inhabit. And whichever camp you fall into, there is no denying that Rollin cinema revolves around them. The men spend most of the movie trying to understand what's happening, and the women usually already know. Rollin is finding his rhythm. This is probably the biggest takeaway from revisiting the Nude Vampire. Rollin has not abandoned his style, he's refined it. The pacing is better judged. The editing flows more naturally. The narrative provides enough structure that the dreamlike moments become more effective rather than more confusing. It's almost like watching a musician release their difficult but fascinating debut album, then follow up with a record where all the same ideas suddenly become accessible without losing their personality. That balance is incredibly difficult to achieve, but Rollin doesn't completely nail it yet. But you can absolutely see him moving in that direction. How was it received? Commercially, not brilliantly. Critics remain largely baffled by Rollin's approach. Many still couldn't reconcile the mixture of arthouse surrealism and exploitation aesthetics. But modern audiences often respond much more warmly to the Nude Vampire than they do the Rape of the Vampire. Why I hear you cry? Well, because this film feels like a filmmaker gaining confidence. It's easier to recommend, easier to revisit, and perhaps most importantly, it's easier to see where Rollin is heading. Looking backwards from films like Fascination or The Living Dead Girl, this suddenly feels like an essential stepping stone rather than an odd curiosity. Final thoughts. If The Rape of the Vampire was Jean Rollin learning how to dream on film, then The Nude Vampire is him learning how to guide us through those dreams. Not with a map, let's not be ridiculous, more like a flamed torch. I mean, there's still mystery, still symbolism, still moments where you wonder whether you've accidentally fallen asleep for 5 minutes, but there's a confidence behind it all. The images are richer, the storytelling is stronger, the cinematography is more elegant. Most importantly, you can feel Jean Rollin becoming Jean Rollin. And that's what makes this second stop on our Summer of Rollin so rewarding. We're not just watching a collection of vampire films, we're watching an artist slowly discover who he wants to be. And that's the really exciting part. If this is the leap he made between films 1 and 2, oh, well, we have one hell of a summer ahead of us here. And there we go. So yeah, you have managed to survive 2 relative deep dives into the very first 2 movies on this exploration of Jean Rollin. The way I've been calling it, the Summer of Rollin, because it keeps rolling. Limp Bizkit will be suing me, but that's just because they've never seen a Jean Rollin movie. And if they did, Fred would let me off. You hear me, Fred? You would let me off. So yeah, I mentioned at the start of this episode that really I wasn't going to go into the nuts and bolts of the actual special editions that I have here. What I will say is, when some labels put things out, I'm going to score these both, but when some labels put specifically Euro exploitation movies out, especially from this time period, the 60s, 70s. And I look at companies like Arrow, you look at companies like 88 Films, Vinegar Syndrome, for example, Synapse. When you look at these companies, you are in a mixed bag depending on what movie it is. Sometimes all they have is the early materials, maybe archival interviews. Other times they manage to track down the key players that were involved and get them sat down and work through them. So you can get a little gleam into what things were like. You can obviously get subjective opinions from those that were involved in the projects. But Indicator, like specifically on these ones, Indicators have been a great label all around. Once again, not sponsoring this video, hopefully reposting this video. They really don't like release anything by half measures, and this is the prime example. You are spoiled on this. I cannot stress this enough, between alternate versions of the movie, like full-on archival information behind it, video essays, commentaries, like gorgeous booklets in here as well that go really in depth. So some of the information in the booklets for both these titles formed part of my show notes, as did some of the work behind the documentary that Kat Ellinger put out a couple of years ago now, where we interviewed her. So that interview exists somewhere in the Podcast Under the Stairs archives. Maybe not on YouTube, but certainly in the podcast waves. But some of that as well. And yeah, all my sources, if you want to do further reading, will be listed in the show notes for this episode. So please go and check out and support the people that actually put the hard graft in. I might sound quite smart from these videos, but a lot of the legwork is done by the people that wrote that source material, which essentially I base my review around. Well, I haven't based my review around those, my actual scores at the end. Rape of the Vampire, now this is an incredible set, and this is probably as good as the movie's ever going to look, and it is gorgeous considering it was shot, well, you heard the story, 2 different productions, 1960 on next to no money. I'd give this a 4 out of 5 in terms of the overall package. I'm not going to review the movie, but I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5 because I do think they managed to capture a lot. It's a great entry point, really, if you want to chart the journey. It's not, I would say it's maybe not the best first Rollin movie to watch, but I think once you've got a few under your belt, some of the later ones, coming back to this really does kind of set the Rosetta Stone for it all. So 4 out of 5 for the old Rape of the Vampire. I have a soft spot for the Nude Vampire. I really, 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 really do. Once again, this set is really, really, really great. You've got additional content on here, like later shot kind of shots and whatnot, and brilliant analysis on here as well. Once again, a great book included in the set. It's a 4.5 for the Nude Vampire for me. I would certainly say start with this one before Rape of the Vampire, but this even wouldn't be my entry point. We are going to get there as we work through. So yeah, 4.5 for this. 4 for Rape of the Vampire. Thank you very much for checking out this episode. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, closing out the show, doing it right after this. And you have been checking out the Podcast Under the Stairs. This is the first episode in our Summer of Rollin series, where we look at the entire chronological filmography of Jean Rollin releases. Got to stress that, releases, because dude made a lot of movies that Indicator have distributed out there. So once again, I think it's 15 or 16 titles, I can't remember. I think there's 8 planned episodes, 2 reviews per episode, and we'll be dropping these every week to week and a half from now on to take you right through the summer. So there's a lot of content coming your way, and hopefully you enjoy it as much as I have enjoyed putting it together. Some of the recordings of these reviews have been recorded weeks and weeks ago, so we're splicing a lot of interesting things. So if the voice changes in between, I may have had a cold or something like that, that's why. It's not all recorded in one day. It's breaking the fourth wall. But yeah, thank you very much for checking out this episode. If you're checking this out on YouTube, then subscribe. Hit the bell, that way you get notified as and when episodes drop. If you're checking us out on Spotify video podcasts or using the Anchor app, thank you very much. Make sure you're subscribed there. If you're checking us out on Apple, one day we will be in video on Apple. That'll be nuts when that finally happens, but it will eventually. So I would subscribe there anyway. Subscribing is the best way to support this particular podcast. It means you get access to all the episodes as and when they drop, and access to the entire 1,400 plus episodes of Podcasts Under the Stairs that exist in our archives. Tons of stuff if you get bored in between. That's why I can go away for a couple of weeks and feel comfortable that people won't leave, because there's so much content for you to go and check out. As a last announcement, at the time this episode drops, we will be about a week away from the return of the B-Movie Blitzkrieg podcast. That is the podcast that myself and former stalwart of the Podcast Under the Stairs, the Baz, do. We have 20 brand new episodes that will be dropping one every 2 weeks between first week in July and end of March 2027. So a whole run of stuff there that you check out. Some of the movies are gloriously bad, some are incredible, and most of them Baz has never seen before. So that's going to be a pure joy and a delight. So, all that is left for me to say is thank you very much for supporting this episode and supporting this show. Wherever you are, whatever the time zone is, and whatever you're up to in this big bad world of ours, please take care of yourselves out there. This is Duncan McLeish broadcasting live from under the stairs, and I am signing off.